Greetings and welcome to the Progressive Christians podcast. We are the love your neighbor kind of Christians and not the storm the Capitol kind. So if you're curious about what a socially and politically progressive Christianity looks like, then this is the podcast for you. My name is Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, and I'm your host. I am a professor of theology at Methodist Theological School in Ohio, and I am the lead pastor of the Loft Faith Community at Westwood United Methodist Church in Los Angeles, California. Please rate, review, subscribe, all that good stuff, especially to our YouTube page. Please, if you're watching this on YouTube, give us a like and subscribe. That would be amazing. And today, everybody is back. We've had like multiple episodes where all of us have been together, so that has been
it's like we're getting better at scheduling or something.
It is like we're getting better at scheduling. And it's about to get messed up because I'm going to be traveling.
Short-lived.
I hope y'all enjoyed it.
I do hope you enjoyed it, but it's summertime. It's summertime.
Yeah.
And that actually is one point we want to raise is this. We're recording this episode probably a few weeks before it's going to be published, because I will be traveling to South Africa to teach a course for a few weeks. Wesley probably has some festivals or concerts or something he's going to be going to.
It's summertime. 100%.
I will be driving children back and forth across the city of Los Angeles to and from camps and swim lessons and all sorts of other fun things. That's what my summer's going to be.
Love that. Sounds like a wonderful summer. The lessons, not the driving back and forth.
The fun stuff, not the driving.
Yeah.
I wish I could skip the driving, but we do live in LA.
The driving sounds terrible. The driving sounds terrible.
Julia, I don't have any plans.
You're doing fun.
I'm speaking to the ether that Julia is just going to have so many gigs this summer. She's just going to be on set. So she's just like not even going to be able to record.
Yeah,
exactly.
Manifest it.
That's great. Thank you.
Manifest it.
Point being, this one is being recorded out of order into the ether. So if something insane has happened in our world and we're not responding to it, that is why.
Yeah, we're not
because we're
ignoring
in the
it.
past.
We're probably in it.
We're probably
we're living right before it. We don't even know.
Right. Exactly.
We're in the past.
So in today's episode, we are going to be, I guess I should say, maybe give a little bit of context in terms of how we came to this idea of the episode. We should be talking about like spiritual growth or Christian maturity, perfection, if you're a Methodist, however you want to describe it. But I kind of want to just set the table a little bit about how we even got the idea for this topic. And it really came up during our conversation a few weeks ago on the podcast about why we're Christian. And Blair, rightfully, I would say, pointed out that it was better to say that people were immature Christians rather than to question the truthfulness of their Christianity, which, to be fair, is where my instincts lean. To be just transparent. I get frustrated. I'm like, how can you call yourself a Christian?
Kicking people out of the club, voting them off the island is like way easier. Psychologically, It's way easier.
It's not even like it's not. I'm like, why are you using the label? So it's not almost that I don't want to kick them out. It's just like it's a lack of understanding. I have a hard time understanding why they find it useful. And you helped, which is why we're having this conversation. Because what Blair mentioned was about essentially stages of faith, like the ways in which we kind of mature, or we have the opportunity to mature in our faith, whatever that faith may be, over time. And this is an instance where I would say this doesn't fall neatly on progressive or Christian, or progressive or conservative, as I should say. Like a binary. It really is a process where you can be either conservative or progressive and still be an immature Christian. Perhaps, for a conservative, it's about promoting or accepting policies that aren't really reflected in the gospel, and maybe preferring a vision of God that's rooted in revenge that you see in the Hebrew Bible. And for progressives, it could be something along the lines of criticizing someone for having dehumanizing policies by using dehumanizing language, and also like literally reflecting, mirroring back to them the violence and harm that they are doing to you. I see both of these as acts of immaturity. And so Blair, I want to kind of toss it over to you to kind of explain a little bit about what you, the framework for stages of faith, and kind of how you've been, one perspective, I should say, and how we might think about the process of Christian maturity. And I didn't even think about this, but she said, I invite you to share something about Wesley, but we can do that. If that neatly fits in,
Oh,
we
well,
can
yeah.
talk
I
about
can
it.
always
But,
talk about John Wesley.
I know.
My buddy J Dubs.
That's
So
what we call him in the streets, J Dubs. That's what we call him in the streets. We be like, J Dubs.
If you know, you know.
If you know.
I don't, like, most good Wesleyan Methodist scholars have like this John Wesley bobblehead that's like ubiquitous. I don't have one. I need to get a John Wesley bobblehead so that I could be like appropriately have my J Dubs representation. But the reason you're bringing this up is that John Wesley very much had like a developmental understanding of faith before we had the understanding of developmental psychology. What I'm going to talk about and introduce you guys to today is the idea of the stages of faith, which comes from a United Methodist minister and clergy person and PhD academic psychologist named James Fowler, who was at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University and the Emory University Department of Religion, which is my MDiv alma mater. And that's where I learned about stages of faith. But he was a psychologist and developed this understanding of the development of human faith over the lens of human developmental psychology from Jean Piaget, Erik Erikson, and those kinds of classical psychology thinkers. And he developed this, it's 7 stages technically, starting with 0 to 6, and developed it throughout his career, but it now has become sort of a classic in psychology. It's used beyond Christian thinking. It's definitely created with a Christian framework in mind, but definitely also has ways in which it represents sort of just general development of relationship between the human and the divine across different kinds of world religions. Conversations about when we apply Christian ideas to world religions is a whole nother conversation for a whole nother podcast, but know that this is like rooted from a Christian perspective, but also is applicable in other ways. So as I talk, guys, like jump in, interrupt me, ask me questions, tell me what you're thinking as I describe these. But I'm going to describe these stages, give it like a rough overview of what they look like, and then we'll have some commentary as I go. But stage 0 is called primal undifferentiated faith, and this is the very beginning of what we call like attachment theory in psychology, developmental psychology. And I'm using an article from the American Institute for Learning and Human Development. The article is written by Thomas Armstrong, who is also a PhD Christian professor. And he just does a great job summarizing these. So I will be pulling from this, but also drop that in the show notes so you can read along. But stage 0, primal undifferentiated faith, from ages birth to 2, is when we're just like figuring out where we exist in the world. And the author talks about Erik Erikson's first stage of trust versus mistrust. He says, here the baby acquires experiences from the outer environment that either instill in him a feeling of trust and assurance from being comforted, living in a secure and stable environment, and experiencing a sense of consistency and care from the parents. These personalized experiences, according to Fowler, essentially translate into feelings of trust and assurance in the universe and harmony with the divine. Conversely, experiences of parental or environmental neglect and or abuse at this stage of development can result in the formation of feelings of mistrust and fear with respect to the universe and the divine. So even before babies can even conceive of the divine, before babies can even conceive of who is God, they are understanding that they can or cannot trust the things and the people around them. And so this is why we baptize babies in the United Methodist Church, is because we want babies to know that they are loved and they are a part of the community of God. And we want to use that language and have that environment around them. But I know one of the controversial things that came out in like the Quiverful movement is the blanket training. that babies, before they're even crawling, like you start to punish them for wanting things.
What?
Yes.
I'm like.
You said
what are
quiverful, and I'm like, I'm about to learn some things.
You
I'm
haven't
like,
heard
what?
of this?
No, I know
I've
what quiverful is, but like this other stuff, absolutely not.
Blanket
time. So it's like this idea that desires are sinful, and so you have to train babies to not want things and to not disobey. And so you put a baby on a blanket, and if they try to get off the blanket or they try to get to a toy, you're supposed to pull the toy further and further away. And then if they get off the blanket, then you're supposed to spank them. And this is with like babies under the age of 1, right? And that is like you are forming neural connections about trust and mistrust in those babies that then get attached to the divine and parents and community and everything else.
And this connects so directly to what we talked about CPTSD.
100%.
So one of the reasons that like people were talking about this because of the documentary Shiny Happy People, which is a documentary about the Duggars, and they describe this. But one of the questions was, well, why are these kids, like conservative kids are always so well behaved, but it's really just evidence of
trauma,
abuse and trauma. But yes, that's
afraid.
why, because they start
afraid.
harming them when they're infants.
You know, one of the things that I think I've come to understand as I've gotten older and have a deeper understanding of my own thinking and neurotype and disabilities is when I'm motivated to do something. If my motivations are because I'm afraid of doing something, or I do it because of a sense of fear, I'm almost certain that that's rooted in some other past experience. One might say trauma, but also just say experience. That isn't actually pulling me towards a person I see myself wanting to be. When I'm doing something for love, I'm doing something because I love someone, is way more often what I feel like makes me come alive. What allows me to feel like I'm actually engaging in the world as my full self versus doing something because I'm afraid of how someone might react. And what you're describing, Blair, in terms of this early stage in this kind of training, is the ways in which you have, honestly, people who aren't psychologists, people who aren't, it's like James Dobson, right? You get these people who like don't have the actual training. They're telling people how to raise their kids. And again, I'll say this, and Blair, I know you got to talk a little bit more about this early stages of the first couple of when they're kids, but I always go back to what made me realize I don't want to use corporal punishment or anything like this, is because I learned when I was learning about, ethnic studies and cultural studies about how these kinds of methodologies of corporal punishment arose as a way for Europeans to control Black bodies. Like once I could make that through line of, oh, this is like some old slavery vestiges, I was like, I'm out. Like literally, I'm just like, it was easy for me to be like, nope. Like why am I going to keep doing some old slave stuff to my own kids? That don't make no sense, So I was just like, yeah, it's ridiculous.
And even with white kids, right? It's about economics of, right? You had children in an agricultural society so that you had farm workers and you train them very, very young to be contributing to the household or not. And so corporal punishment made sense because that's how you embed the easiest managements, like the easiest pathways for control. That if you only trust your parents or your caregivers as the people who feed you, and you're afraid of the consequences of what you do, what will happen if you don't follow what they tell you to do, then you're going to be compliant.
And that's why we're all at where we're at now.
Yeah. So, I know we talk about like deconstruction, but like deconstruction, and we've also talked about reparenting, but like it goes back. Yeah. And so like, I also will hear people say like, well, my kids are getting old enough. Like, I think they should learn about faith now. Like, friends, if you're a person of faith and you want your kids to be raised in the faith, have your babies in the church, not like literally in the church, but like don't give birth in the church.
I mean, I don't know what kind of church y'all go to, but
but like be embedded in a community that's ready to receive your child from day one, because they are learning about the world from the people that you surround them with. So we're only at stage 0, my friends.
I know.
Yeah,
I want you to say something about the most important parts of stages 1 and 2, but just a tiny quick story. So we were Isaiah was back in Michigan visiting one of Gabby's friends, and Gabby's friend does not go to church, and their kids don't go to church. But in Michigan, it's rural Western Michigan. Everybody else goes to church, right? And so her friend's kid turns around and says to Isaiah, do you believe in Jesus? And so Isaiah looks at her and he's like, yeah, I believe in Jesus. My dad works at a church. And she's like, oh, okay. And she's like, I believe in Jesus and unicorns. And like, and just goes about the conversation they were having. And just like, and it was, Gabby telling me this story. I was like, this is hilarious. There's something else she believes in too. Maybe Santa Claus. I can't remember. I don't know. But the point is, as you say, Blair, like they're learning their faith, regardless of what you're teaching them. Right.
Yeah.
They're learning it. So I was like, that's so funny. So,
well, and that actually is a pretty good description of like stages 1 and 2. So stage 1 is intuitive projective faith. Fowler originally thought this was like ages 3 to 7. And this is where children are acquiring language, symbols, stories, things that are surrounding them in their religious structure and in their worldview. So like you said, Santa Claus, like we don't do Santa Claus in my house, but Santa Claus is like out in the ether. And so my son knows all the stories about Santa Claus. And that's like part of his psyche now at 5 years old. And often this learning is unconscious, but it's mostly experiential. And it develops through encounters with stories, images, the influence of others, and a deeper intuitive and sense of what is right and what is wrong, innocent perceptions of how God makes the world function. Like this is the like storytelling time when kids are learning in song and learning in storybooks. And so I actually pulled out some of my favorite storybooks because it leads into whatever they're experiencing in stage 1, this intuitive projective, what they're feeling, what they're knowing through a story, song, leads into stage 2, which is the mythic literal faith. And this is where children start to apply justice and fairness and like stories of right and wrong. And you start to think through ideas of reciprocity. If I do good things will happen to me. If I do bad things will happen to me. This is often when kids start to like understand concepts of like sin and heaven and hell. And this is sort of elementary age. Like Fowler said 7 through 12, but I think it's really like kids start doing this at like 4 or 5 even. Or I've seen them do it at 4 or 5.
This is a stage where also I want to say this is when they start becoming snitches. Is what I learned.
Yes.
So
yeah.
Oh yeah.
Like
100%. Oh yeah. See, I know Wesley and Julie are like, because this is what I have had to wrestle with Isaiah.
Wait, what?
Yeah, because
tattletales. They start as tattletales.
Oh, hey, no, we use
and then
snitches.
They become snitches.
Yeah,
okay.
Isaiah.
A 3-year-old cannot snitch.
Hey, no, not 3, but by the time you're about 5.
Okay.
I'm like, hey, you need to be understood.
Yeah, what's
like,
the difference between a tattletale and a snitch?
Yeah, Julia, help us understand what's the difference between tattletale and a snitch.
I think a tattletale genuinely thinks that they don't understand that there's anything. They think they're doing the right thing. I think a snitch is playing a different game. A snitch is aware.
Trying to get themselves out of trouble.
Yes.
And this is why I see when I would go. I'm telling you.
Like,
I'm telling you. I'm telling you.
This is why I use the word I use.
I'm like, when I'm in, I'd be volunteering in this kindergarten classroom, and I see these kids about to get in trouble, and they're like, "Oh, but he was doing," and I'm like, "See, you snitching." And like I'm telling you, I'm like, I have a strict no snitch policy in this house.
There's a great old psychology experiment where they set up a tattle phone in a kindergarten classroom or a preschool classroom. And so every time the kids wanted to go to a teacher to tattle, they had to go to the tattle phone instead. And they recorded kids tattling on each other to like examine this stage of development when you start to understand what's right and wrong and what are the kinds of things that they feel like motivated to tattle on their friends about. That's really
cool.
It's a cute little YouTube video. I will definitely share it. But I wanted to raise some really great picture books that I love because in these stages, these early stages, both stage 1 where you're like really it's about song, it's about story, and then stage 2 where you're starting to learn like fables and lessons and this is what this story means. This is what it's teaching us about how we're supposed to behave. And if you just straight read the Bible to your kids, like that's confusing. There's some violence and like strange words and
Yes.
most children's Bibles for a long, long time just like really stunk. Like they were really bad. And like we tell the story of Noah, but without telling any, we just take away the bad parts. Like the progressive response was like, well, we won't talk about the bad parts. Whereas like really old children's Bibles would be like, the world was so terrible and sinful and had wrath against God, and therefore God's wrath destroyed the world with a great flood. And that's how like the story of Noah starts. And then we get out our 2x2 animals, like, and then progressives were just like, well, we won't talk about sin at all. It's more complicated than that. And thank goodness we have like smart people who are making good religious children's books now. So some of my favorites are, I have The Blessing of You by Mark Batterson and Summer Batterson Daly. They're Episcopal. And this is talking about like who kids are made to be. So talking about you in relationship to God. I also love this. This was posthumous from Rachel Helda Evans. She had written the text, and then Matthew Paul Turner illustrated it and released it with Rachel's husband. And what is God like? And this, when we're talking about in stage 1 and stage 2, is when we're embedding those stories. So especially in stage 2, people will talk about God as like, this is when you start to think of God as a he, as having this white beard and this floating man in the sky, because that's what's shown to you in the stories in Sunday school. And so I love What is God Like, because it's saying we can't really know, but we can see. And so it gives all of these beautiful images of like God is like the wind. God is both here and also there and swirling. God is an artist who's creative. So like I love this story. I read this with my kids all the time. And I love too that my son will say, well, God is everywhere. And we'll like talk about things from the story where he's like, oh, God is there in the rushing wind in the trees. And so when you give kids alternative visions and alternative stories, they embody that and they take that in. And then I also read to them sort of stories with lessons from other faiths as well. So we have one that's about the story of Passover by David Adler, talking about let my people go and justice. And then we also have one that was given to us when my first was a baby called Little Sid, the Tiny Prince Who Became Buddha. This is by Ian Lendler, and Xanthi Buma is the illustrator. And this is the story of Buddha, Siddhartha, who becomes Buddha. And amazing, like really phenomenal lessons about life and what's important. And then the Book of Belonging is a new one that's come out. And this is Bible stories. It's Bible stories for kind and contemplative kids. And I will post an article in the show notes about this book, about how amazing it is. This is new as of 2024. And it highlights the stories primarily of women. So a children's Bible that hits all the highlights, but also focuses on the women in the stories. And then this is also when we get like mythic, literal, doesn't necessarily have to be just from the Bible, but also, as we said, what is God like? The Blessing of You. My absolute favorite theology text, I think it's my favorite theology text, period, is Old Turtle by Douglas Wood, and the watercolors are by Cheng-Khee Chee, which is a story about basically how the creatures came to know God and the people came to know God, and then they lost their way, and how nature helped them find God again. And it's like one of my I cry every time I try to read it. It's so good. And so the stories we tell our kids are what they're learning about how the world works. And most people will move out of stage 2 into stage 3. And stage 3 is synthetic conventional faith. And this is when you start to understand your place, not just within relation to the divine, but also within a community of belonging. And so stage 3 is where you start to have personal religious beliefs. You understand yourself as a Christian or as a Buddhist. This is when we tend to do confirmation in the United Methodist Church, which is the process of like helping children who were baptized as infants come to understand the beliefs and the doctrines of our church, so that they can decide to accompany that or embody that identity for themselves. And the thing about stage 3 is sometimes it can keep the right and wrong rigid, like fable, binary stories, justice oriented, or not complex justice oriented, but like black and white, right and wrong, mythical storytelling from stage 2, and then just gives you a place of belonging where that is the thing that everyone believes. So some people will stay in stage 2 religious thinking and
Forever.
take on stage 3 religious identity and then never mature beyond that.
Yeah.
And they just kind of get stuck there. And that's what I often will say is like arrested development. And so because you're keeping this like kids' brain function of what is right, what is wrong, what is authoritative, who can and can't tell you what to do, who can and can't tell you what's right or wrong. And then you come to belong in a community where everyone believes those same things. Many people just never challenge it. And so we have a whole lot of people who are in arrested development in stage 3, this synthetic conventional faith.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I think when Paul is talking about early Christians, or he's talking about the Corinthian community, and he talks about, you basically when he uses the phrase about being like a child, and when I was like a child, I thought like a child, and now you're an adult, you're supposed to do adult things. Or he uses metaphors often of some kind of maturity, whether it be milk and meat, things of that nature, where there's a space for this, but you're expected to grow out of it. And I think what I'll say a little bit later is it's getting stuck in those binaries are comfortable. They give you a sense of structure that I think we all at some point you need. And I think there's not recognizing the inability to challenge those structures, or seeing the flaws in those structures, I think can obviously lead to the stage of arrested development you're talking about, Blair. But also some of that's like just when you combine that with the social political tension that's in our world today, poverty, you see why people can cling to that sense of collective identity, because it's the only thing sometimes that feels secure. It's the only thing that feels secure. And so, Wesley, I know when I think about and I know we're going to talk about this in another episode, but I think about like immigrant families and like the need to, and why many of them can become politically and theologically conservative is because they're like, gives us a sense of structure and belonging to a space where otherwise they might kick us out. And this gives us a sense of security that we otherwise wouldn't have. Well, Blair, I'll go ahead, Julia.
Well, I was just going to say, I also think that if you grow up in a world where there are very distinct boxes and you happen to, for whatever reason, fit neatly into them, I imagine that you would never have a cause to ever question them, which is like a different type of thing. Like, I mean, I'm observing that it always comes at some point. If you live long enough in the world. But I think it makes sense to me that for people who are white, straight, all of the things, why would you ever question it if you fit right in?
Well, I think the thing that could cause them to question it is actually looking at why they're suffering and actually seeing the role they play in it versus externalizing it. I think that's
Not
actually what
everyone
happens.
suffers.
I think there's a great deal more suffering, even among middle-class white people, than I think they actually want to acknowledge as their actual suffering. And I disagree, Julia. Everyone does suffer. Suffering is inevitable.
Well, I mean, I think suffering is.
Go ahead, Julia.
Well, I was going to say, of course, suffering is inevitable, but this is the thing that we've talked about, that there's like a difference between like
manufactured suffering.
Like we all experience grief. We all experience loss. We all experience loneliness and like all of those things. I don't necessarily think of that as suffering.
But it is. I think this is the thing. It is. It's not. And what you do with that suffering, I think, has a lot to do with the degree in which you mature. If you look at why kids bully other kids, it's an inability to deal with their own suffering. Like all this stuff comes back to your ability to actually be self-reflective and deal with your own. I was about to almost cursed. Deal with your own stuff.
Loneliness, is that suffering? Like, oh, I'm lonely. Like, is that suffering?
Yes,
probably.
I think for me, what helped me understand the difficulty of people struggling with loneliness is when I was a pastor at the church in Compton. I had several members who were taking care of partners who were in the final stages of life, and just how difficult that was and how alone they felt because the person that they had lived with most of their life was leaving them, and they had felt, broadly speaking, detached from that person for the years that had been up to the end of their life. And you see the impact of loneliness. I'm like, no, this is profoundly, this is suffering. I think loneliness. I mean, I got a book right behind me about
And I think though
about
that it becomes easier when you're in stage 3 or stage 2 to then loop those feelings of suffering into the stories about what you already know is supposedly right and wrong.
Yes.
And this is where we get that like sin-based, I'm lonely because I haven't followed God's will. I have lost my spouse because I wasn't faithful enough. My career hasn't launched because I haven't sowed enough seed in the kingdom of God with my finances. And so this is where people get taken advantage of, is if they're in stage 3, they understand themselves as belonging. They understand this like rudimentary understanding of God and God's rules. Then it's easy to manipulate people in that stage by creating additional stories, whether or not they're actually grounded in scripture or like the reality of like the human experience. Because conflicts are dangerous to someone in stage 3 in synthetic conventional. Like something that challenges your faith, it is easier, faster, feels in the moment healthier to just say that, well, that thing either doesn't apply to me, or that thing is sinful, or that thing is heresy, and to just describe a reason why the whatever the conflict is that would challenge your faith, or the difference in experience that would challenge your faith, why that doesn't belong. That is easier than grappling with the reality that you yourself are in a box, and that there are other experiences in the world, and that actually you need to go through an additional phase of growth. And that's why it's so easy to manipulate people who are in stage 3. So there are whole churches, whole swaths of religious belief that are in this synthetic conventional. How you move to the next stage, which is stage 4, the individuative reflective stage, is like, that's the deconstruction. That's the crisis of faith. That's the something actually breaks your ability to belong in the community. So maybe this is where like harm, abuse, people can't put up with it anymore as a part of their faith life, so they leave the church. But it doesn't always have to be. It can also be like someone you love. In an ideal world of discipleship, someone you love and trust challenges the way you're thinking, invites you into new experiences, takes you on a pilgrimage to another country, another culture, another way of living, another way of expressing your faith, takes you to churches that don't look like yours. And so when we do this well with young adults, Fowler says it's like mid-20s to late 30s. I think we should do this with 16-year-olds. Like, this is teenage. To me, this is really good youth group, is like, if we do really good confirmation and we like help them solidify their identity, then the next phase is to break it before they go to college. Because if we don't break it before they go to college, it'll break in college. And then often people lose their faith in college because they're away from their original faith community. They haven't prioritized finding a new one. And so they go through this process of having their faith and their beliefs and their worldview challenged by all the things they're learning in university, all the different kinds of people they're meeting. And if you don't have a safe place to return to work through that, then it just gets broken and it never gets fixed. It's deconstructed, it's never reconstructed.
And this happens in seminary too. I mean, I know, like, if you, many people that went to seminary had not had that faith breaking experience or the deconstruction experience. And I would argue deconstruction, if you haven't gone through a period of your life where you've had to do some kind of repair work on your understanding of who God is and what God is, I would question your maturity and your growth. And it doesn't necessarily have to be as Blair as you described. I do think an idealist should happen around the time of high school, but I often think another time I've seen happen is again around death, for anyone, but particularly kids. How you talk to kids about death really can help them understand their relationship to the world and relationship to God. Because it's complex and hard to explain, right? To be like, hey, this person is no longer here, but they're still with us. How do you make that make sense? And I think for some folks, they can do like, well, they're in heaven and everything's okay and you're going to see them later, versus actually talking about the feelings that come up with processing that. And what does that mean? And what do you actually think theologically? And how do you reconcile the fact that we are not beings that live in these bodies forever, right? What does that mean for confronting the realities that we see every day? And so again, this usually, sometimes this even can happen with a pet that dies. Like I've had students when I was teaching undergrad where they flew home because their pet died, and that broke them, right? Something happened, and you hope. And Blair, even as you're describing this, I realize now why I had so many students in my office hours who were not students I was their advisor, but because they had me for one of their religion classes during their first couple of years. And as they were going through this reconstructive piece, because something had broken, I had become their trusted person, right? That they felt comfortable to talk to. I think that's an important phase that it's I can see how if it happens away from some people that you trust, a person at least that you trust, harm. I would say harm. It may not get put back together. You may find yourself not putting together a strong structure of faith after that.
Yeah. And stage 5 is that putting back together. It's called conjunctive faith. So literally like conjuntos, bringing together. And it's where you start to like piece together the parts of your faith development that you want to keep, that you see as valuable. And you start to resolve conflicts, and you are able to hold a multi-dimensional perspective that acknowledges truth as something that cannot be articulated through any particular statement of faith or belief structure. That basically life with the divine and life with humanity is complicated, and it will always be complicated. And a lot of people actually will go back in stage 5 to, especially if they were raised in like a more experiential kind of liturgical space, or maybe if they were raised in one kind, they go find another. So we see a lot of folks who were raised in like mega church, like high energy, like emotional control music kind of space, who go through deconstruction, and then they're actually coming into like the Episcopal Church and the Catholic Church because they have in those settings that same kind of like embodied experience of worship. We call it smells and bells in pastoral training, of like incense and chimes and chanting, because it gives your body a similar sense that like mass singing moment in the megachurch does, but it's attached to a different kind of theology. And so we're seeing sort of a return to liturgy, I think, within millennials and sort of older Gen Z, especially in the ex-evangelical community, because you're trying to pull back pieces that you did love about what it meant to belong to a community, the stories you know about God, what that taught you about who you are and being loved. And you're trying to find that again with theology that matches or doesn't disregard the ethical values that you have developed through engagement with a diverse set of people.
So what's this last stage? Or
the last stage is stage 6. It's called universalizing faith or enlightenment. Fowler actually said like nobody actually gets here. Like it's where you like transcend the need for religious belief and religious belonging, and you just sort of float in the world as like some people will say like Gandhi or MLK got to this stage, but like in reality, Gandhi also still had very strict Hindu beliefs. MLK had very strict and structured religious beliefs. And so it's sort of like the ideal of a sort of Buddhist enlightenment where you no longer need to belong, that you are sort of one with God. And in the Methodist world, we would call this like sanctification, that you're actually reunited with God. But the reality is we all live in human community, and that means that we're constantly managing boundaries and borders and identity. And I don't know that ever truly ends.
What you just described to me is death. Is that not death?
Yeah, I think like ultimately, so can you experience it?
So we all do get there.
I don't know, but like, yeah, the idea is when we die, that's the reunion with God. But there are definitely some religious beliefs or religious teachings that say you can get there before death. You can have this universal moment. I think what's damaging about having a stage 6 is that you get people who claim that they are enlightened and they are universal, when in reality, actually, they're just operating in stage 3. They're just operating in like a super liberal, like interfaith coexist, but it's also can be like very strict and very dehumanizing, as you said, Dr. Carter. And the idea of having like an enlightened faith can actually be very damaging and dangerous if you use it as a way to judge other people.
To me, stage 6 is much. I think it's evaluated by how you treat people. That's what I'll say, but I'll get to more of that in a little bit. When I was thinking about people who I would call enlightened, that's what I thought. I was like, who would I in my learning, right? Who are the people that I've read or encountered that actually would say, no, these folks would have reached something that I would say maybe fits that pattern. St. Francis. The more I learn and read about St. Francis, the more I'm just like, yeah, he kind of was like a like, I don't think many of us don't realize how close the Roman Catholic Church had come to collapsing under the weight of its own unscrupulousness, like the weight
Hubris?
of it. Yeah, hubris, like just weight of like just thieving, like just corruption. And St. Francis basically helped like save the church. It was really super corrupt. And St. Francis would definitely be one. Many of you, I'm going to say a name that many of you probably don't even know because it's so inside the weeds, but there's a priest by the name of Meister Eckhart, who is a deeply contemplative. And when you read or listen to his I can't listen to him because they're in German, but like the English translations of his sermons, just really profoundly spiritual, had a deep sense and understanding of transcendence and what it means to. He's a mystic, as I would say. Basically, he's a mystic. And I would say Howard Thurman, another mystic contemplative. These folks I have found, and all three people I'd lean towards are people who I would classify as mystics. I do think there's something to be said, but I think Jesus was a mystic. And y'all know that, right? To me, there's something to be said about reaching this mature level of faith and understanding, as as I've said before, the line between the profane and the sacred, between ourselves and God, it's much more blurry. Like the space is much more blurry than we'd like to actually realize. So one of the things that I wanted to this stages of faith for me that it sort of mapped onto one process that I really liked, or I guess an understanding of spiritual maturity or formation by the Franciscan monk Richard Rohr. And he has a book that came out many years ago called Falling Upward, A Spirituality for the Two Halves of Life. And actually, I was introduced to this book by a member of our church, Lauren
Miller.
Yeah, and I had read Richard Rohr, but I had not read this particular book, and it has really influenced me to the point that it's assigned reading in my constructive theology class. I mean, it's definitely something that I love. And I'm just gonna briefly describe his process, but also I want to get to, and this kind of gets back to the conversation we had earlier, Julie, about suffering and growth, because I think this is stage 3, broadly speaking, Blair, is where I feel like this is where a lot of people get stuck. And I think it's our response to how we get to this particular stage that has a lot to do with our ability to mature or to stay stuck in a kind of arrested development, as you described it. But so in Rohr's book, he describes the two halves. He says the task of the first half of life is to create the proper container for one's life and answer the first essential questions. What makes me significant? How can I support myself? And who will go with me? The task of the second half of life is quite simply to find the actual contents that this container was meant to hold and deliver. And I think what he means in his first half with the notion of the container is really about like developing a kind of what he would call an ego structure, that developing a sense of identity, a sense of who you actually are. And this requires having rules, having processes, believing in those binaries we discussed. It's using the books that you talked about, Blair. It's those building a strong sense of self so you can feel confident in knowing who you are. And this is and this is the danger you said earlier, actually, Blair, about when you don't do faith formation with kids, when you just say, hey, figure it out, you kind of, without that kind of sense of identity, you can, I would say you can fall victim to any kind of number of beliefs, rather than thinking that you can teach kids to, you can just, figure out what you believe when you get older. I think they'll walk through life, quite honestly, not sure what to believe, if they believe in anything at all. That's kind of this first half of life.
Because if you don't tell kids or help kids figure out what it is they believe, they're going to the world is going to teach them.
They find it on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
Oh God! Right now, yes. YouTube. Apparently, YouTube is where you go to figure it out. And a good friend of mine, I've recommended this book because his sibling, I think, is going through what we might say is the first half of life done poorly, is what Reservoir calls it, and they are having a midlife crisis. And when he's describing to me what's happening in their life, I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, they are freaking out because they are unhappy with how they've done the first half of their life. And what he says, Roy writes, is when you are unhappy with the way things have turned out, you try to go back and redo it. And it's ultimately like the midlife crisis. This is the people, going out buy a sports car, divorcing your partner, doing all this other kind of stuff, right? Because you're trying to rekindle what it was you had when you were younger. But really, it's that you have come to realize the rules you were taught are that you had made fixed and rigid in your mind aren't actually as fixed and rigid in real life, and you're trying to figure out how to navigate that, and you're stuck. So this is where I think you get to Jesus on a Sermon on the Mount saying, "You've heard it was said, but I say this." Right? Jesus is literally upending the 10 Commandments. Right? He's saying like these are the things we were taught, but there is gray area here that we have to wrestle with, and he's pushing people to do that. And often that gray area arises, we learn about it in light of our suffering. And so this is where I think, in our own journeys, we have hit those spaces that called us to do the deconstruction, where many of us began to grow. And so I kind of want to toss it out to y'all, because for me, Blair, I think this is like what I guess in the stages of faith, to me, this is the stage 3. Something happens. How do you respond to it?
It's stage 4. Yeah.
Or stage 4.
Yeah.
Yeah. Stage 4. What something
How did
happens.
you move from basically the faith of your childhood to something else?
Yeah. And so I wanted to toss it out to y'all. And just kind of for us to, peel back the curtain a little bit, give people a little bit of insight about how we got to where we are. And invite one of y'all to share maybe what happened for you that caused the kind of that led you to the process of deconstruction and to reconstructing your faith.
Funny enough for me, it just was a thought. Like nothing happened. I grew up in a world where you're supposed to always ask questions, and I just always asked questions and thought about things and would read and ask other people. And I finally found a question that I couldn't conceive of an answer to.
Mm.
And it was just a thing that I'd never considered. And that was, what if there is no heaven? And then it led me to like, well, what if there is no God? Like that, and that like it was in my chart. I knew, like I was meeting with friends and they're like, I did your chart and I see that it's coming, that this is happening in your 9th house, whatever the house is, that is like faith. So it was always going to be that way.
I have
And
no
it
idea
rocked me.
what chart you're talking about.
Yeah, tell
apparently.
people what you mean by chart. Her
Like your
birth chart.
astrology, your birth chart.
Astrology.
Oh, I'm like, what?
It
Your
was
chart?
like you're like my Saturn return fell in. I don't remember what house it is, but it's the one that rules faith and religion. And so it was told to me that that's what was happening when I didn't know what it was.
Mm.
Stage 3 was say that's evil divination, but stage 4 and stage 5 would be like, hey, that's tools to help you understand yourself. That's
Evil
great.
divination.
I love that.
But it rocked me. I lost my mind, and I didn't have anyone. I floated through it honestly until I found the loft. I just kind of was like, I didn't know anyone who was asking these sorts of questions. I didn't have any tools or resources. I didn't know what to call it. I didn't have even no one had said the word deconstruction to me. Like I just spun around for like 2 years.
Yeah, but I mean that's a real powerful question, though, to be like, hey, what if there's no? I'm like, yeah, that seems, because then it's like, what if there's no justice, right? That to me is how I could see interpreting that question, and that's like really, maybe that's not how you did, but that's what I thought. I was like, oh wow,
well, for me, it had to do with like family. And so it was like, oh, so if there's no heaven, it's not going to be like, I die and then go kick it with my granddaddy. Like, it means that I'll never see him again, which was like, that was really the most painful part of that realization of like, oh, so what I had with him, he passed away when I was young, when I was still in high school. And so just and it was always just like, oh, but then we'll kick it later. Like, I don't know. Like,
The mythic literal says the story is we're all back together in heaven, right?
Exactly.
So just like, I'm just going to hold on to that because that's easier.
And so not just easier, but I didn't even know that there was another thing to think about. And then once I did think about it, and I'm like, oh, wait, so then that's not going to happen. And then that's a different type of grief. That's like,
Yeah.
but now I'm like, I mean, now I just believe something so different that it's like, it's not grief. But like at the time, it was like the process of coming to understand that to even do that, you have to deal with, it's like everything that you pull apart reveals grief and like a disappointment and like a reframing. And that takes time and patience and honestly support
Yeah.
and guidance. It's a hard thing to do. It's a thing that's meant. This is why I believe this is the probably, now that we're talking about, the reason I believe that faith should be done in community. Like the idea of loneliness is like is the idea of like the gap between the social interactions that you have and the social interactions that you need. Everyone needs different things, but it's like if you're grieving the impending death of your partner that you've been with for 50 years, there should, in theory, like you should have spent your life in community, both of you, with other people so that you have people to walk through that with you, not that you are left alone or feeling alone. And that's like when I think of suffering, I'm like, so much more of it is manufactured than I think we even realize. We are like, we've jumped the shark as a society. We have screwed the pooch. We are off the rails. Like we are doing so many things wrong as a culture.
I was just laughing at screwed the pooch. I just had that expression makes me
Screwed
laugh.
the
Anyway,
pooch.
all right, Wesley.
Yeah. So what led me to the process of deconstruction? So I mean, I grew up in the Church of Christ, very fundamentalist sort of tradition, and I grew up closeted. And even though my home community never really spoke about homosexuality, because I believe it was an immigrant community who worshipped in Spanish, and so some of the culture wars, so to speak, that were happening in American evangelicalism didn't really touch. I think if I attended I worshipped in a building that had both Spanish and English services. If I attended the English ones, I would imagine I would have gotten a lot more of it, but I didn't. So lucky me. But I think when I went to college, when I was at UC Berkeley, I ended up taking a seminar course with about 8 students. And what it was about is sort of like a historical reading of the Bible. Sort of the professor was sort of taking the text and sort of approaching it from a historical lens, trying to understand what was happening around the time, figuring out how was the Bible constructed, all the things that, you learn when you go to seminary or you as I ended up at a Christian university, you're like religion 101, your Christianity 101 sort of approach. But what it gave me the permission to do was to begin to look at things differently and permission to ask questions that I knew were there because I never felt like I didn't belong as a queer Christian. I just had like understandings that some people thought that some of these things were not so great. But I knew they were inconsistent with sort of how I was experiencing life. And so I knew that there had to be something else. And so that class was sort of the first time that I was like, oh, maybe the idea of Christian higher ed never really made sense to me up until that point. And so the idea of going to a university that was Christian didn't feel like, wait, what do you mean? Some of them don't believe in dinosaurs. And so there was an aversion there. But then, so I knew I needed more, a deeper sort of like approach to my faith and sort of academics and how I began to think about things. So I ended up going to a Christian university in Iowa. And at the time when I, even in California, as in the closet, I was quite a contrarian. I think in some ways people see it now as well. But I think at that point, not only was I, a closeted Christian who grew up in a fundamentalist church, but I was also conservative. And so when I went to Iowa, I landed in a very conservative bubble, but it was a conservatism that looked nothing like the conservatism I experienced in California. And so not only were these people deep Republicans, but they were also deep Christians according to their own self-assessment. And what I started seeing was at the same time that I was opening up about how I could read and interpret and engage with spirituality, with Christianity, I was seeing reflected back at me Republicans in small town Iowa and how they understood the humanity of other people. And so growing in one sense, seeing sort of like being sort of held back by the rhetoric of Republicanism in small town Iowa, I was like, oh, this isn't for me. This can't be for me. This shouldn't be for anybody. But here we are. And so I think those two happening through my sophomore year of college is what, if scriptures aren't clear on homosexuality, what else aren't they clear on? What other spaces am I allowed to open up to larger swaths of the people, to maybe a more universalist sense of salvation, or heaven, or the eradication of hell, like as a concept? And so I think that's where that started, and obviously since then it's just been gangbusters. So now I am at the space where I am, where it's like I don't claim Christian, but I can't let go of all of this deconstruction that I've done, that have centered people, centered humanity, centered human flourishing as the thing that I'm supposed to be striving to help people, myself, and other people achieve. And so in whatever ways that I can engage with that potential, that's sort of where I'm pushed to.
I was thinking, thank you so much for sharing. I think I would have loved to have seen conservative Wesley go to Iowa and to see how that happened. It sounds hilarious because you are so contrarian. That's what's so funny. You're like, some people call me contrarian. I was like, well, obviously, like that thing, like, yes. Like people with eyeballs and ears, yes, they call you contrarian.
Yeah, but I think I was worse. So
I could see you being worse as a young person too.
Also learning how to be contrarian in a kind way. That is also like a growth. As one who is also contrarian.
I know. I'm like,
has he figured it out?
It depends.
We'll never know.
It depends. I think like when you're more tired, like that's the degree to which you can be more confrontational. Oh man, that's so funny. Blair, is there something? I know it's a bit different for clergy sometimes because there are lots of things that lead us to the path that we're on. I find, but all of us have some kind of, usually whether it be a call story or something that happened to us that kind of pushed us in this direction. But I'm curious for you, if there's some part that kind of you felt like was pivotal in your own maturation in your own faith.
Well, again, I'm lucky that I was raised in a church that was very inclusive and open and culturally engaged. And my like stage 4 was actually getting exposed to real evangelicals and having to go back and be like, okay, this whole swath of people thinks that the church I was raised in is heretical and wrong. So what if they're right? Like, what if women shouldn't be pastors? What if queer people aren't loved by God? And the beauty of being raised in the church was I just went back to my home church. I called the pastor I grew up with and I said, what do I do? How do I figure this out? And he just gave me a bunch of literature. And with a couple of other friends I'd gone to church with growing up, we kind of from afar on different college campuses went through and like relearned why we believe that queer people are made in the image of God and beloved, why we think women should be a part of the clergy and the leadership of the church. And I had to decide that those were beliefs that were correct and were worth holding on to. And so my stage 4 wasn't violent. It was hard, but it wasn't like life altering or earth shattering. It was just, oh, this is work I have to do for myself. And I'm really grateful for that. And yeah, it led me to seminary because I was like, my question was, how did so many people just like, how do they still not get this, that God really does love everybody and is for everybody? I got to figure this out. And that's what led me down the path to seminary. It was like, I have to understand how so many people have a faith that is so different from mine.
Yeah, it's this pursuit of trying to understand why people do what they do, which deeply resonates with me. It also sounds like this happens to you, Blair, like as you mentioned earlier, while you're in college, like while you're in undergrad is when you began to have that kind of. And so in this sense, it's really good that you, even though you weren't, you were in a faith community. I know that you were telling the story earlier, but that's what brought about the questioning, so that you had a faith community you felt like you could speak back to, right? And I think that's yeah, it's a certain kind of maturity that you already had right there that I think is really, in hindsight, turned out to be something that shaped you more than
and
you
the
even
maturity
realized.
of my faith community, right?
Yeah.
I grew up in a stage 4, stage 5 faith community, not in a stage 2, stage 3. I grew
Yeah.
up in a faith community that was full of people who did have different beliefs, but were already in a maturation process of understanding that we ought to be, must be, can be community across our differences, not in spite of our differences.
Yeah.
And so that's my luck. My luck of the draw is that I was raised in that community.
That is something that moved me yesterday in our church service, because the high school seniors spoke as they are getting ready to start college. They're going to college. And these are like kids that we've seen grow up, which is wild, crazy. And they all gave speeches that were it just was really encouraging, because I'm like, oh, they like us all being together for the last 10 years through a pandemic, far apart, but like coming back together, and like how we've rebuilt, and the questions that we ask on Sunday, and the way we like, all of that does matter. Like it really does. And I know that some of them will be like they're going to go to school with a different understanding and a different place in their stages of faith, and because of that they will be balms to people, to their own peers, and they will have the ability to be like something for someone that I didn't have,
Yeah.
because and that's like due to us collectively, us as a community in Westwood, and I was very moved by that.
I think those rituals are critical. And I would actually say, I think lacking those rituals is a one reason why I think people can get stuck, right? There aren't processes by which we allow them to move past some of the, or maybe not move past my variable, to name what they're about to experience as this pivotal moment in their life and in their spiritual and intellectual maturity. And this is why they have these rituals in many religious traditions. Christianity, unfortunately, we had a catechumenate ritual, I would say, but that's been long gone. And literally, when I said catechumenate, probably all like, what is this guy talking about? Again, I'm talking about like this is old stuff. But I wish we still had a catechumenate, but whatever, man. This is why I feel like I could call this podcast like the
We
progressive
could.
Christians or like the radically orthodox. Like, people know what the hell this man's talking about podcast.
But that's
What is
part of
this
what
word?
So that's part of what stage 5 is about, though, is like recapturing, re-embodying, recovering the things that are healthy. And so the catechumenate is basically the way of training.
Yeah.
So it's we do confirmation, but then we sort of like let our youth go, and unfortunately we lose a lot of them because we don't build strong intergenerational connections that they feel like they can call somebody when they're getting challenged, when they're across states in college. But the catechumenate is an adult formation process that basically leads you through, in community, all of the stages of faith.
Yep.
And then as you move through them, you actually, part of the catechumenate is mentoring back and becoming a teacher and one who walks with those who are in the stages behind you. And it's still part of the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. But it's often thought of as a way to like cross from being non-Christian to Christian, or like your membership class. But it's so much more complex than that in the ancient teachings.
It's much more than just like membership, and it's much more even within the Catholic tradition now, where it's more like confirmation. They've really made it more like a Protestant version thing. And so anyway, again, this is me. This is why I'm like, oh yeah, Meister Eckhart. Like, this is all this old stuff that maybe 3 people listen to this podcast are like, I know that guy. I think for me, and I know Wesley and Julia, y'all know most of the story. Now, Blair, you may not know the story, but for the most profound experience for me that has shaped my faith and that moved me to having a more mature faith was in seminary after having been a pastor at a church and doing my PhD. It was I had just finished my second year, so I was in my third year of my PhD. Finished coursework. I'm preparing for exams, getting ready to present a huge paper at AAR, and Gabrielle and I go through a really, really difficult separation for about 5 months, and it ostensibly, I would say, it was my dark night of the soul. It was the breaking. It was breaking. Like, I was broken. Like, in all sense of the words. Like, I was depressed. I wasn't eating. I wasn't sleeping good. I had quit my job to like focus on school, but in the process of doing what I realized is in the process of going to seminary and pursuing what I know as my vocational call, I very much became, I got further detached from my own sense of self and emotions. And I became much more of a person of the mind rather than a person who understood their body. And now, as I've gotten older and gone to therapy and done much more spiritual formation, I realized part of that was because I had a undiagnosed disability. I didn't realize that I was already predisposed to do that anyway. You put me in a space where people do that well, and I could be rewarded for it. It just accelerated it. And so, Blair, this is why, like, I know you saw me have a deep conversation with Frank and Andy, Frank Rogers and Andy Director a few weeks ago. And I can't recommend their books enough. Frank Rogers' book, Compassion in Practice, was profound for me during this moment. It gave me the tools I needed to turn inward and do some healing, to be compassionate towards myself, but also to understand this was a process of self-exploration. And it ultimately, if I were to say why this was a moment of spiritual growth, is because I realized how much I can't control, like that I'm not in control, that my wife has left me, and there's literally nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do that can make her come back. It's going to be her choice. And that kind of awareness of how much I actually don't control, that all I can control is my response to things, has continued to shape my thinking about the divine, about relationships, and what it means to actually hold yourself accountable, right? Than anything else. And as thankfully, after months of therapy and talking and other kinds of things, we were able to reconcile. And if Gabby was on this podcast, she would tell you that it was much more. I did a significant amount of work. Like, I basically didn't do any schoolwork that semester in order to save my marriage. Because it was never a question of love. It was always a question of could I I would say a classic example. I laugh because in my mind now it's funny. A classic example of what led to the separation would be she would tell me about what was going on with her. She'd be like, well, I'm really upset about this and blah, blah, blah. And I would deconstruct her argument and be like, well, you shouldn't feel that way because A, B, C, and D. And if that's how you felt, this is why your feelings are wrong.
Super helpful. I can totally see why it worked or didn't work.
How structured of you, Dr. Carter. How structured.
Here's an outline for your feelings.
Yeah, so you bear with someone like that for a few years. At some point, they're gonna be like, "Yeah, I'm out." And so and I realized it put me in a space where I had to learn how to feel my feelings. And so much of my spirituality had become intellectual. I had I would tell students, thinking about seminary, you go to seminary, I think you learn to fall in love you come to seminary having fallen in love with God with your heart. In seminary, you learn to fall in love with God with your mind. And I think for me, that moment for me was how I was able to combine the two, and how I saw those things as deeply interconnected rather than something separate. And it pushed me to what Rohr would call like the second half of life, like this kind of spiritual maturity, if you will. So he describes the second half of life is connecting to the bigger picture. He writes, what looks like falling can largely be experienced as a falling upward and onward into a broader and deeper world where the soul has found its fullness, is where the soul is finally connected to the whole and lives inside the big picture. He also recognizes that people who are transformed in this way come to serve and not be served. And he said, until and unless we give our lives away to others, we do not seem to have them ourselves at any deep level. And I think for me, like, this is where I can see someone's degree of maturity. Like, are they transactional? Or things in their spirituality more about how it helps them? Or is it more about coming to serve others? I see that, like, that's probably the way I would say I judge many a clergy in terms of their capacity to and willingness to actually serve rather than do things to put them in positions where they look a certain kind of way for things to serve them. Um, so so yeah, that's kind of how I would say, and that kind of fits into the stages that you had mentioned, Blair. But for me, that this second, the reason I would say I like it, and I'll stop and give y'all space to share, is it's linear in as much as you see it's a pathway of progress, but it doesn't necessarily require, you can be a young person and be in the second half of your spiritual life. You can be an old person and be in your first half. It's much more about how you respond to experiences. And one of the questions that I think is really helpful in terms of trying to understand and assess where we are in this kind of like process of growth is like, are you able to look at like your fallings and your failings? Like, are you able to actually look at your failures and learn from them? Or are you a space where you're just kind of like, I don't want to look at where I have done poorly. I don't want to look at where I have not grown. I kind of just want to blame it on others. Do I externalize everything, or do I have the capacity to say, no, what's going on in me, and can I look at it? For me, this has been critical, and it's about accountability, but also other things too. I know Julia just had to drop off, so because we went a little bit long, but I do want to, before we wrap up, say a little bit about, or at least invite y'all to say what you thought about this kind of second half spirituality, second half of life, and how it does or doesn't resonate either with the stages of faith, Blair, or if it makes kind of sense to your own experience, Wesley, about what it means to kind of become more a mature person of faith.
Yeah, I think so. When I first encountered this sort of the second half sort of concept, I think it's it feels like it's we're giving people language by which they can reframe what is happening in their spiritual faith, in their spiritual experience. So, because like the idea of like falling upward is obviously a little confusing, but the way I'm sort of like thinking about it is these things will feel like failures because so much of your initial upbringing gave you concrete black and white non-gray sort of like understandings of your faith. But the second half is about saying is being like, okay, but they don't have to be black and white. They don't have to be sort of adhered to in this specific way. You're giving yourself permission to like open up the bag, shake it around, and say some of these things don't sound good. And that's not regression. It's not a failure. It's growth, but it feels like it's the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, it often feels like failure. Like, you can, like, growth hurts, and I think, and our inability to deal with that failure is the challenge. I think, one of the question I was trying to remember, um, that Rohr has in his book is, are you open to exploring your own dying, stumbling, mistakes, and falling? And if not, what prevents you from doing this? And so this is why I get so frustrated when people can, follow someone like Donald Trump, who is clearly not open to thinking he's done anything wrong. And like that is a sure sign of the immature person, like when they don't think they've ever done anything wrong. And it's a sign of weakness. Actually, a kind of a actual kind, and somebody who projects himself as a strong person has this kind of obvious weakness by inability to actually be self-reflective and acknowledge that they've made mistakes. Is a sign, really that should point us in the opposite direction. And so, Wesley, as you're describing, how do we come to understand our mistakes as where in places that we grow, right? At places that actually push us, because obviously having a separation is not like a great thing.
No.
It doesn't sound like a good
It
thing
also
for a
doesn't feel
marriage.
good.
It felt absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
It felt, I don't have words to describe. Like it is the single worst feelings I've ever felt in my life. Like it's just the absolute, I don't know what death will feel like, but I felt like I was dying. In my head, I felt like I was dying. And so, and yes, the thing that moved me out of that was the desire to save something that I know was meaningful. Um, and it was an accepting of like that I won't let this be the end. Like literally, I was like, this will not be the end. It and I just remember saying that. I'm like, no, I will do everything I can. And if it ends, it ends, but it won't be because I just decided I was just gonna let it fizzle out because I wasn't gonna do the work that I felt like needed to be done to try and at least rectify this relationship that we had. Um, I think the last thing I wanted to say, and it's kind of out to, I guess maybe let's to tie things up, if you will. And this is, Blair, even going back to your stages of faith, um, and Wesley, some of the things you talked about in terms of your experience in going to Iowa, is this concept of mirroring or wrestling with our shadows, if you will. And it's some of it with shadow work is looking at like the things that, do people actually mirror our true selves, or are they projecting their own stuff onto us that we're having to work through? And I think what Blair, you talk about in these books, is helping for kids to give the understanding of who they are, to give them a sense of structure and identity, so that they can actually look into a mirror and say, okay, this is who I think I am. And as we get older, having someone that actually can be honest with you and tell you the truth rather than what you want to hear, right, in love, I think is critical for that kind of growth. And so both of you shared, to an extent, examples of stories where you had someone show you, mirror who you were, but not in a way that was critiquing or judgmental, but a way that was saying, this is who I know you to be, and this is going to take some growth for you to get to where I think you're going. But it's not in a way to say, no, I guess maybe a better way to say this is Jesus saying you have to leave home. This is just literally Jesus said, like, you know what? You got to leave home. You got to hate your father. You got to hate your mother. You got to leave in order to join me. You can't just be with the people who you've always known. You have to leave your home in order to grow.
And we make parallels to parenting a lot, I know, on this podcast, but it's because it's taught me so much about being human. I think a lot of people who never develop past stage 3 and in faith, but also like not in understanding of themselves, in their worldview and their psychology and their ability to handle cultures that are different than them, worldviews that are different than theirs. And if your parents, the people whom you trust most in the world, if you are raised with strong, healthy attachments, can't help you challenge yourself and then mirror back to you to help you sort of pilgrimage away and then return, you just may never do it because it's too scary, because you don't have that person. And so I think again, church community can stand in that way, can build those foundations, those relationships, those spaces of trust. But also I know this is why like a lot of millennial and Gen Z folks are no contact with their parents, because they did move into stage 4, into stage 5. They're trying to challenge the way they were raised and come up with something that's more complicated and more complex, and their parents won't do it with them. And when you want to return to the people who should be able to lift the mirror and help you understand yourself and your place in the world, and they can't do it. The pain of that is so deep. And so just knowing that many of our listeners probably have had to mourn and lose those relationships that were supposed to be those spaces of safety in order to grow. Know that you're not alone in that, and that I think these generations, we talked about generations on the podcast recently too, are generations of millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha, who are the most diverse generations in history in American culture. We're doing that because our coworkers and our classes are more diverse and full of different people, and hopefully our sanctuaries and our Sunday school rooms too. But it may mean that our relationship with the generations before us just won't work, and that's hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about mirroring, what comes to mind to me was it wasn't until I really got to like Iowa where I started to see the mirror of who I was claiming myself to be reflected back at me in ways that I didn't care for, because the context of conservatism, religious or otherwise, had changed so drastically. But it still held the same name, the same title, the same general functions. So it wasn't an honest friend or a loved one. It was sort of a body of people reflecting authentically themselves, and me being in the midst of them saying, oh, this is what this means. I'm not about that. So let me find something else. Yeah, but it was also like, the university that I went to had so many faculty who were affirming, not in like public ways, but in ways that, when they spoke about scripture, when they integrated into their teaching, it was more open-handed than it was strict. And so I'm glad that I ended up where I ended up at a Reformed Church university, because it wasn't, Southern Baptist. I think my experience would have been completely different if I had been somewhere in Texas. So yeah, I'm grateful, and I'm glad that these structures, help put words or terms or sort of signposts to what I experienced.
And I think what you described in terms of mirroring is a process of being able to have people show you like how they were trying, how basically your experience of them were like, oh, this isn't who I am, and not allowing yourself to be wrapped up in that label, and say, having the maturity, I guess I should say, to actually be like, well, that's not me. You're projecting this onto me, but that's not who I want to be. I'm not going to let it. It's literally like the manifestation of, sticks and stones would break my bones, but words would never hurt me. But like the actual mature part of being like, oh no, that's not who I am. And I'm okay with that. I'm not going to allow what you're saying to shape how I perceive of myself. And that's a kind of maturity that's really difficult. I think we like to believe that, but I think that's really, really hard. The last thing I'll say before I wrap up is there's this, at the very end of Rohr's book, he has a set of questions that I think is helpful, and that to me resonates with the work of Howard Thurman in his autobiography. He says meaningful spiritual questions are to ask, the only meaningful spiritual question to ask yourself is it true? Not who said it, or does the Bible or the Pope say it, or do I like it? And it's one of the things that I got from Howard Thurman's autobiography, where he wrote, it's in the religion because it's true. It's not true because it is in the religion. And this is where I felt like, yeah, this is why I said this is a person who reached a kind of, stage of spiritual development that was far outreaching where I've gotten. I'll just say that. Far outreaching where I have gotten, but also why I'm teaching a class on him, and why if you're watching on YouTube, you can see a book that I got behind him. I mean, it's someone that is a mentor, an ancestor that is a mentor for me. So, well, I want to thank you all for joining us for the Progressive Christians podcast for this episode, thinking through spiritual formation. We hope you found it helpful, and this is a kind of evergreen episode, I think, that people can return to over the course of their own spiritual journeys. I think, I'm hopeful that as y'all listen to this, you find it helpful in your own path towards where you see yourself going. This podcast is a ministry of The Loft, a worship community of Westwood United Methodist Church. If you'd like to connect with us and be a part of the conversation, you can find us on all social media platforms at The Progressive Christians. Our show is mixed and edited by our wonderful audio engineer, AJ. Again, we want to invite you to rate, review, share, subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you're using, especially YouTube. Please like and subscribe to us on there as well. And we will see y'all next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.